Hey, Chris, thanks for joining me. We've been working on these considerations of unintentional stressors that none of us can really control by the definition of their term that happen to our lives, medical events, professional decisions, and quandaries that we find ourselves in, relationships, etc., and how we can use intentional stressors to some degree to be able to offset these. But there's some dangers and trappings in those. And in talking about that, right before we started recording here, you were talking about a few things that are really motivating you recently in some of your personal and professional aspirations. Talk to me a little bit about what you were elaborating on there, because I think we would all benefit from your focus right now.
Yeah, well, first off, it's always a pleasure and privilege to be able to connect with you, Mike. I'm gonna stroke your ego a little bit. Not that you have an ego, but I was
I'm gonna
talking to someone
I'm
the
gonna
other.
hit pause on the record.
Yeah, no, but someone asked me the other day. They're like, "Who do you think the best therapist is in the world?" And I said, "Easy, it's Mike Studer." And I don't say that jokingly. I really mean that. I think your
Thank you.
command of just various domains, while also having spent so much of your career in the trenches with people, where you see when you take a lot of the science and information out of a vacuum and you have to apply it to a person who has doubts, fears, anxieties, you really have deep learnings and you realize just how messy this is, but also, the importance of behavior change and getting people to take ownership and to make sure that you're sort of, you make it known that you're in their corner and that you're a good person to troubleshoot with them. Um,
Thank you.
but yeah, to unpack what we were talking about before, I'm working on a piece of content right now, and it pertains to screens. And anytime we bring up a screen in, physical therapy, or if we, almost narrow it to MSK rehab, people naturally conjure up stuff like the FMS screen, different
Mhm.
screening tools for various pathologies.
Mhm.
Those are not the screens I'm talking about. The screens that I'm referring to there's really three main screens.
Yeah.
And just think of these as like an old Japanese blind, like an accordion
Mhm.
blind.
Mhm.
So the center screen is the whole holistic person, right?
Okay.
Who is this person? What's their identity, right? So what we see a lot with runners in particular, which is sort of an area where I've niched down, is that is their identity,
Mhm.
right? And I'm always trying to say, well, no, you're also perhaps, a father, a sister, a brother, a friend, a colleague, right? So that center screen is, again, the whole holistic person, their
Mhm.
various identities, and then
Mhm.
their core values, right? I think where people get into trouble with stress is a good thing, and there are use
Mhm.
stressors and
Mhm.
distressors.
Right.
But I think that things become a distressor when people haven't taken the time to map out their core values,
Mhm.
and they invariably start living in dissonance with those.
Mhm.
That's what creates distress to me,
Yeah.
right? So that would be the center screen, person's identity or identities,
Mhm.
as well
Mhm.
as their core values, which can
Right.
change as a function of life experience. And
And
then there's
context, right? Because you can
for
have different identities in each one of your spaces, as we say, right? Your one, first, second, or third spaces. But continue on.
Yeah, in that context can change over the course of the day. Like in the morning, I wake up and I'm a husband, I'm a partner. My wife and I talk about things, right? We talk about the family, we talk about aspirations, dreams, things we want to do together. And
Mhm.
then my kids wake up, and now I'm like really in father role, right?
Mhm.
And then I drop my kids off at school, or she's doing that today, and now I'm really locked in on my professional identity, having this
Mhm.
conversation with you. So with the left screen, this is really people's fears, anxieties, constraints,
Yeah.
right? And I think that putting those down on paper is a really liberating thing, because I think these things tend to permeate our thoughts and brains, and that gets us into a lot of trouble, and also causes us to spin our wheels and burn cognitive matches, right?
Hmm.
Which is a
Hmm.
big concern to me as someone who spends a lot of time working with runners and endurance athletes dealing with bone stress injuries because
Hmm.
they tend to perseverate. And I don't think we're discussing, the energy toll that takes, that
Hmm.
cognitive,
Yeah.
right? And then there's, the right side, which is what are the things that, are working in your favor?
Hmm.
What are, sort of certain qualities, attributes, forms of creative expression
Hmm.
that you can lean on to get you out of situations, or things that you've done in the past that have allowed you to navigate difficult situations. And,
Hmm.
you could use something like the brief resiliency scale. I think that was done by Ohio State, to sort of
Hmm.
get into that end of things. And
Yeah.
then below at the bottom of all of that, I say these blinds rest on a foundation, which is from a clinical interaction standpoint, what are the points of truth here, right?
Hmm.
Really important as clinicians when we work with a patient that we agree on those points of truth, because if we
Hmm.
don't, I think that it detracts from the potential outcome that we could enjoy. So
Yeah.
the points of truth could be, okay, you started developing pain. You run 30 to 45 miles a week. This was insidious in onset. It's not located over a tendon. It's getting worse with running, right?
Hmm.
When you rest, it feels better. Currently, you're taking medication to navigate your pain because it's interfering with your sleep.
Hmm.
Um, your diagnostics, if you've had any, show X, Y, and Z. It's real, and I have a whiteboard right here that I
Hmm.
map stuff out on. So I have like literal screens in my
Yeah.
clinic to put this down,
Wow.
because I think when you put it on paper, you put it on a whiteboard, you're giving it life, and you're also already starting to solve some of
Right.
the problems and challenges. So yeah, so that's where my mind is
Wow.
professionally. Yeah.
I have to tell you, I mean, I've got a couple of questions and thoughts that I know that I'm going to work into our conversation, but I want to lean into what you're speaking of here, because I have to just ask you, do you feel like in the right-hand screen with innovations and playful experiences and things that energize me, etc., that I can actually build a resource of some of those cognitive matches available to me in the left screen, the healthier that I am in my rightward screen? Can a person build? So that's question number one. Can you develop a collection of more matches or buy matches, if you will, in some other fashionings? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, and maybe that is the next screen, But I think that starts to get at the plan, and
Yeah,
I think that through imposing stressors that you have control over,
right.
that sort of put you on the brink of your abilities but allow you to keep showing up, I think that's how you actually um, would probably go about doing that. And
Yeah,
I need to reflect more on that question, but I think that's what allows certain people to navigate these situations, um, and
right.
get on the other side of them in a more timely manner, versus
Yeah,
people who may not have had the privilege to expose themselves to controlled stressors.
right.
We had talked about Jordan Hansen, who, he and a team of guys, I think there are four in the boat, rowed across the Atlantic Ocean in a
Mhm.
human-powered vessel, which is the first time I think it's been done. But what was really impressive is not only did they win that race, but I think they beat the equivalent of, like, the British Navy SEALs by a handful of days,
Yeah,
right? In Jordan, we brought him in one time for a conference to speak, and he said, nothing's more powerful than essentially being able to program stress that you also have the say in, because at some point a stressor is going to choose you that you don't have control over.
That's
And
right.
you'll have the fortitude, the resilience and the mindset to be able to navigate it more
Yeah.
effectively.
Yeah. Well, and you know, this is not a rhetorical question or a rhetorical conversation. I mean, you've seen the entirety of the article that I'm preparing right now, and you know that I am heavily biased toward this capacity that I referenced back in my question that a person should be able to build up a collection of matches. Whether that analogy rings perfectly true or not is yet to be said, but we at least understand and have proof that physiologically an individual's cellular resistance, psychological resistance, call it mental health and what you will benefit from subjecting yourselves to thermal extremes, if that's your choice, physical extremes, exertion, etc., potentially intermittent fasting or food scarcity that you've chosen. Again, all of these are intentional stressors, and we know that it's a developing science. But I'm going to lean one more time into your left screen and just ask you one more clarifying point because I want your opinion about this. You had mentioned these cognitive matches in terms of the load that these stressors may have on an individual. And I'll have to ask to you what your thoughts are as we explore it a little bit more deeply. Do you think these cognitive matches cause someone to feel a degree of cognitive fatigue, or is it plausible that these cognitive matches, when we've consumed let's just say, uh, a repletion of them, that they begin to borrow into our physiologic resources as well. So maybe they're more than just cognitive matches, and we borrow into truly life-sustaining, bone deposition. Do I have enough testosterone to be fertile, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think they definitely dump into physiology. And that's a thing that when I work with someone, for example, who has a bone stress injury, I work with a bunch of different demographics who sustain these, people
Mm,
who may be new to running with spike workloads, people
mm,
who, for example, there's a woman who came into the course in New York that we basically did a case study with towards the end of the class. And, she was a unique demographic because her background, she did all the things that, that we see in the literature safeguard against bone stress injuries in terms of playing court sports, not specializing in running early on. Her menstrual function was good, but she
mm,
moved from California to New York, and I don't think she appreciated the physical demands of being on her feet for 30,000 steps as opposed to maybe 10,000 steps,
yeah.
New York versus
Mhm.
California.
Right.
Then I'll see people who are professional athletes who, they're just the sheer volume and intensity of their training day in and day out tip the scales. But the folks who I see that spin their wheels and have the toughest time from a recovery standpoint are the ones who tend to perseverate and vacillate over their situation. And, as I sort of mentioned, seem to be burning more
Wow.
cognitive matches. Those
Mm,
are also people who seem to deal with more of an underfueling situation, which could be
mm,
unintentional underfueling.
mm.
It could be disordered eating, or in extreme cases, eating disorders.
Right.
So, you know that their bone health and properties have been compromised.
Mhm.
That's a very unique demographic. And I think that because they perseverate over, oh, am I going to be able to run? What happens if I'm not running? And it's a glue that holds their life together. It's an
Mhm.
outlet to distress.
Yeah.
Those are the ones who always have the toughest time, getting on the other side of these bone stress injuries.
Wow. I love that because now you're telling me that the left screen begins to consume the middle screen.
Yeah, a
Hey,
hundred
this is
percent.
my identity, and you can't actually have any of this screen. It's not yours.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I love what you're doing there, and I appreciate your willingness to elaborate on that. Uh, I'm gonna steer us into another question, and I'm wondering. if you have some specific thoughts about some of the programming that we can do around intentional stressors that should be utilized and can be healthily utilized. We know that every person's different to mitigate intentional, unintentional stressors. So, what are some of the go-to things that you look for to utilize intentional stressors to mitigate unintentional for a client that you might have? And feel free to lean into a story, a case example, or even philosophize a little bit, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, and I may sort of shift away a little bit. I'm gonna just share some thoughts that came to my mind and steer
Yeah,
me
please.
back towards a question. But
It's all good.
you know, my main goal anytime I'm working with someone is to try and establish a rhythm with their training,
Mm-hmm.
right? This could be walking if someone is not an endurance athlete. It could
Mm-hmm.
be, whatever activity they enjoy. But when I work with folks in a coaching capacity, I'm really basically trying to, once I get them into a rhythm, stagger high demand and low demand days, but really be consistent with pacing throughout, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think that, when you're programming stressors, for most of the endurance athletes I work with, that stressor comes in the form of intensity primarily. But you can also do some things where if someone doesn't have a bone stress injury and they're paying the energy bills from a fueling standpoint, I'll say, hey, I want you to go out on a 90-minute ride today, and maybe it's in a little bit warmer weather, and I only want you to consume water, right? You're trying to
Mm-hmm.
build glycogen stores. Now, in the context of a bone stress injury, that becomes a very volatile situation,
Yeah.
so keep that in mind. But we're coming up on the Hawaii Ironman World Championships for women. One of the things that you're going to be doing from a deliberate programming in programming stressors right now is heat exposure, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a bunch of ways to induce stress on an organism.
Yeah.
And I think the main thing is you're exposing that person to something that is novel that's going to disturb the system. So, like when I
Right.
work with people, I'm always thinking, how do I gently disturb the system without shocking the hell out of it? Because that's when
Right.
you tend to, cause a longer recovery, if not injury.
Mm.
So, when I'm working with people, that's always what I'm thinking about. I'm saying, okay, what's their general ecosystem? Is this someone who is living in harmony with their core values or in resonance
Yeah.
or not? And then from there, I'm just saying, okay, how do we program or stagger intensity distribution between high demand and low demand days? Right. And I
Yeah.
get to see everyone's feedback and comments. I get to look at their heart rate. They'll share heart rate variability data with me if they're getting it. And when you program in that manner, it seems to really elicit the desired physiologic changes that we're going for. So,
Yeah.
and I don't get this perfect, right? And
Yeah.
I used to really get it wrong, but now you'll see with a lot of the athletes who are following the program, not perfectly, but all of a sudden you start to see their heart rate drop. I had a guy
Yeah.
send me data, his resting heart rate when we started working was 60. Now it's down in the mid 40s, right?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, and you need to be careful of bradycardia and stuff like that to make sure
Right.
that this is a concern or pathologic. But
Sure.
I think that that's a good way to conceptualize things, but throughout all of it, it's consistency of training. They're training most
Mm-hmm.
days, but it's where you're throwing that intensity and to make sure that it really jives with their schedule. So
Mm-hmm.
now I may
That's
have
good.
gotten off topic
No,
there.
no, I love that because it brings me to two questions that come from your answer or come at your answer. I'll state both of them briefly and then I'll elaborate on the first one. So, number one, I come largely from the world of neurologic rehabilitation. Most of the work that I do with patients is indoors and then some training outdoors to help them with community reintegration. So I have four categories of stressors that I can use to do exactly what you're talking about. I'm going to manipulate this task to make it a stressor that is of therapeutic intent for you. And I'm going to state those four in just a minute. The second thought here is what you're talking about here, stressors that can be salient for this individual's ultimate goals. Train up for Ironman that's going to be in Hawaii. It's going to be hot and humid. And you talk about intentional stressors in that light. I love that. And I'll ask you with the other portion of what you were talking about. You said we're going to be training, a day on and a day off. Do you feel like a day off training, just rest, is the best time or the best way to spend your periodization, your micro periodization within training? So I'm gonna bring that question to you second, but be thinking about what you think should be done to recover from intentional stressors. All right,
Mhm.
so now I'm just going to tell you what my four columns are. I think about only four ways to make a task more difficult for my individuals that are seeking more health and wellness, functional capacity, largely and often in recovery from neurologic injury or in efforts to mitigate aging. Number one, we add resistance or task difficulty in some fashion that is a physical increase. So I can add ankle weights, I can add treadmill incline, speed, resistance on a machine. I can add, a weighted vest. I can pull you with TheraBand. So number one is a physical stressor. I make the task physically more challenging. Number two is I make the task more complex. Now, that doesn't mean I'm dual tasking. It's just that the task is more complex, and that may come very simply in an obstacle course or something to manipulate and statically carry while I'm walking, etc. Remember, that's same harmonious task, single task, but it's a little bit harder because it's complex, not physiologically harder, but just complex difficulty, maybe some agility difficulties in there potentially. Tightrope walk, agility ladder, all those make a task more complex, but not divided attention. Number three is exactly what I was already alluding to, and that's I'm going to make you divide attention. Spend cognitive resources to hold on to that concept of the seven WNBA teams that are your favorite while we're pursuing this task. And then when we're done, you have to give me your favorite seven WNBA teams back in order over again. There's so many different ways to dual task, and we're not going to talk about that today. But that's number three. And number four is I add an element of pressure, consequences. This is going to be difficult. You might lose your balance. Or can you beat your previous time? So there's going to be an element of pressure that's either a consequence or competitive basis. Did you beat your previous time, wattage, RPM, speed, whatever? So it's four: physically harder, complex, dual task, divided attention, or a pressure constraint. You just one upped me by saying, hey, how come you never thought about environmental constraints? Adding in heat, adding in sunlight exposure. And I should have put that on there. But, in full humility and honesty, I do a lot of my training indoors with these individuals, so I simply did not. So I'll ask you, with all humor intended, where the heck were you in 2011 when I was in the dark depths of Oregon training the entire fall for the California International Marathon on December 5th that year, I believe? And it was a 62-degree, sunny, balmy day, and I wasn't prepared for it. I ran like a 2:58, and I was trained to go much better than that. So I'll leave that part aside. What are your thoughts about the four columns of stressors that I just outlined? And then we'll get to that second point about rest.
I think they're brilliant. And what I realized is this is very much what I'm doing without basically fully understanding it from a zoomed out view, like you just laid
Okay.
it out.
Yeah.
So, my mother-in-law was over here last night, and she always thinks I'm crazy. Like there was I think 2 summers ago, we had a couple days here in the Northwest where it was like 105, 108 degrees
Yeah.
in the middle of the day, and I was living in South Seattle, and we would always have dinner at their house on Sunday evenings. And I said, "Oh, I'm gonna run over." And she's like, "You're nuts." And I said, "No." I look back, and that was a stressor that was self-imposed. And I
Hmm.
said, "Look, I'm gonna maybe do some walk running if it gets really bad. I'm gonna make sure I go hydrated." But I think these are the things that Jordan was talking about. When you can choose your stressors, make sure you're safe and make sure you
Yeah.
have, one of these bands on you that is an identification band and, use when I'm
You
riding my bike.
you don't mean one of these, do you?
Yeah,
Same,
the road
same thing.
ID.
That's what I've
So,
got.
yeah, but, I think that when you look at things like this, it really simplifies how you challenge or disturb the system, as I was saying,
Mm,
right?
mm, yeah.
So, I think that's brilliant. I don't do enough of the divided attention, and I think that's something I could lean into a lot. And it
Yeah.
makes me think back to an article that Phil Glasgow wrote in the British Journal of Sports Medicine,
Mhm.
talking about simple exercise progression, right?
Mm, yeah.
Where you take something, you know how much I have a fancy for loaded carries,
Mhm.
where you start someone with a weight that they self-select based on the lock
Mhm.
study in physical therapy, because we
Mhm.
underdose patients, turns
Mhm.
out. PTs, especially younger ones, have more fear avoidance type behavior.
Right.
But you give someone a loaded carry, maybe we start them with 20 kilograms in each hand.
Mhm.
And then once they become proficient and confident in that, then maybe actually take them to a loaded march. Then
Mm,
maybe have them do a loaded march forward and then backward. And then maybe you could do it on some surfaces that are a little bit more challenging. Maybe you go from barefoot to being in a shoe that has a little bit of cushion in it, like not a wobbly running shoe, but
yeah.
yeah, you really have my gears grinding with this.
Yeah. Excellent. So now talk to me about your thoughts on rest. Now we both know we could jump into the science of what's best. Is it hot or is it cold, depending on what type of exercise you've partaken. Is it light movement? Is it massage? Is it nutrition? Does it have protein? Is it electrolytes, etc.? But what do you think from a standpoint that if we're going to introduce intentional stressors, what do you think are some of the best go-tos to help a person actually just micro periodize within training off of that intentional stressor so it doesn't become the match burner?
Yeah, great question. I was thinking about this last night because after my kids went to sleep, something that's restorative for me, and I think you have to ask that individual or athlete.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in what does this basically get into? It gets into therapeutic alliance. You're saying,
Hmm.
look, I am not you, and I'm clueless to your situation. What do you find restorative, right?
Hmm.
For me, one of my favorite things to do is to sit in the tub and read, right?
Yeah.
And it's just, and I think whatever rest is, it's not sitting on your can doing nothing.
Hmm.
So for certain folks, it may be spending time with their friends or family. For other people, it may be going on a walk. I know that I love to read. I also know that I love to just hop on my bike and just do a 45-minute easy spin, maybe listen
Yeah.
to some music. So I think that's an opportunity to lean in, engage the person, and say, what do you find? What are some of the activities that you find restorative? Maybe it turns out they like to watch a comedy movie, right?
Yeah.
That's always something that I felt was helpful when I was sort of in the crux of my training for long course racing.
Yeah.
Um, so but I generally don't think of this as something that's entirely passive. And if people want to
Right.
use compression boots and stuff like that, that's fine. But I think that you figure out the answer to that by asking the individual, and then
Yeah.
maybe probe a little bit. Why do you find that to be, and not why? You have to be very
Yeah.
careful. I need to be very specific why.
Yeah.
What is it about reading that you find restorative or that
Yeah.
promotes recovery, right? Um, so yeah, those are
Yeah.
just some. on that
That's
point.
excellent. Yeah. And so I love the fact that one of the gems that you drop there is that, rarely what's restorative should include just sitting on your can and doing nothing, which I think basically your verbatim adopted phrase there. So there's somewhat of a reference to the placebo effect in your comments. And it's possible that it's my confirmation bias reading that in, but whatever this individual believes is restorative will, in fact, be more restorative than what is superimposed, legislated, coerced, or guilted upon them.
Yeah, and I do think there's some stuff in terms of literature that's shown that, for example, tart cherry juice can have recovery properties.
Right.
That I think it's magnesium can be helpful in terms of sleep,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think light activity can also, foster blood flow and promote recovery. I know that anytime after I have a hard session, the last thing I want to do is be stagnant. I want to just get some light movement, right? Um, but I also think that, yeah, you're spot on by saying if someone believes this to be effective, that it probably is more likely going to be for that individual.
Right.
So, yeah,
Yeah, and we
placebo.
can take it from zero, it's a sham, to placebo effect, it's 15%. But ideally, we would be taking something that has some clinical efficacy, viability, etc. So it's 30% likelihood, but because you believe in it, it's 45. And again, I'm just throwing these numbers out there. They won't have any fundamental basis, but what we're saying is that it's an additive effect is belief.
Yeah.
So, Chris, I want to talk with you a little bit about the consideration of taking an intentional stressor too far. What are some of the indicators that you have? You've already mentioned heart rate, and feel free to elaborate wherever you like. What are some of the clinical indicators that you have that an intentional stressor is now accumulating a unintentional physiologic result in this individual? Physiologic, remember, can also include the mind because the entire physiology is included in that term.
Yeah, I think one of there's probably a bunch of things, but when I talk to athletes, I can oftentimes sense through our conversation when I'm on the phone that they have they display this degree of irascibility, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
They may be a little bit more rushed in their conversations. I think one of the big ones though is if someone is getting sick, if I onboard an athlete and I always look at where they're coming from because I want to make sure I don't tip the scales abruptly.
Mm.
So if someone that I start working with gets sick really quick, I say, "Uh-oh, we miss things."
Mhm.
I also know that if I've been putting in a lot of training and perhaps, the stress has become too much, that it starts to interfere with my sleep. And a great example of this is people would always say, "Hey, you must sleep like a rock after an Ironman." And I say, "That's funny you mention that. I don't sleep at all. I'll maybe get like 30 to 45 minutes of sleep because I think that was such a monster stressor
Yeah.
that interfered with my natural
Right.
rhythms."
It was
Uh,
beyond homeostatic. Yeah.
yeah, so I think that you can look at, certain subjective factors. I can look at someone's resting heart rate in the morning.
Mhm.
I want to
Mhm.
just find out, their self-reports.
Mhm.
I think this is something where heart rate variability comes in, and I'm no expert on
Mhm.
that,
Right.
but I know a lot of the gadgets that people are using nowadays will give you heart rate variability. So, um, yeah, those are some of the things that I see in athletes. You can also see appetite suppression too,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
So, you're looking for anything that all of a sudden starts to change. I mean, it's easy if someone gets injured because you're like, "Oh, we did too much. You exceeded your capacity." But
Mm.
there's a lot of other signs where the body's whispering and you
Right.
need to acknowledge it and pivot so the body doesn't start screaming. Um,
Wow.
And I
Where do
think
you
that,
put that inside your screens that we started off with? Is this interfering with their identity, their norm, their biorhythms, or is it actually interfering with their truths in the base? When you see they've gotten sick or they've changed their appetite or they're irascible, I can kind of see where you would put that. I think I know where you're going to put that, but where do you put that inside your screens?
yeah, I think it's like a Venn diagram. It starts to basically be a component of each of them.
Yeah,
But I think it really starts to interfere or thwart with that right screen, the things that
yeah,
people know they
yeah,
can lean on to get on the other side of difficult
right.
situations.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and that's always the thing that I am trying to avoid. And when I start working with athletes, if they want me to step in from a coaching standpoint, I say, hey, not yet, right? So what I suggest is let me just watch you train left to your own devices.
Mm,
So I get a lens into their data. Are they training most days of the week? Or am I starting to see red indicating that they haven't done all of the workouts,
mm,
right? So I want to just make sure that, I mean, this is back to Richard Thalen, Cass Sunstein. I know that
mhm.
you have been the person that turned me on to that book, Nudge.
Yeah,
What physiology responds really well to are these gentle nudges,
right.
so you're disturbing the system a little bit and you're affording it the time to adapt.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, and I always ask people too, I'm going back, sort of dancing around your question, but
It's good.
how recovered do you feel? Like I had a woman who, went out and she did her longest run in preparation for a marathon block. And I said, "Hey, this looks awesome. You held your pacing, like you executed this perfectly." Gave her reprieve on Monday, and I said, "Hey, Tuesday, feel free to pivot if you want. Feel free to extend the walking warm-ups and cool downs and cut the run short if you feel like you're under recovered."
Yeah.
So I think a lot of this, just as much as we rely on tech and some of the quantitative data, that you need to marry that with the person's perceptions and subjective reports. But
Hmm.
I do think that, in terms of answering which screen does that really start to interfere with, it's that right screen,
Yeah.
where people's ability to cope and navigate this stuff and deal with that stressor, it starts to detract from that.
Right. You've robbed me of my ability to have my fun space, my experimental, innovative space, like you were talking about earlier, in terms of, taking your bike and actually just working on innovating and playing with jumps and things like that. And if you don't feel like you've got it all put together, from an energy standpoint, from a musculoskeletal standpoint, from a mental organization standpoint and life stress, you're not going to be able to actually play in that part of the literal sandbox or figurative sandbox, as it were. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's excellent. So, as we begin to kind of wrap up a little bit here today, what I've heard is a lot of personalization, a lot of listening, a lot of reflecting back to what feels healthiest to the individual, observing before coaching, considerations of identity, prioritization for the individual, life stressors that are normal and thymic and expected for this individual, and life pleasures that are life giving for this individual. And, if they're coming to you for a health event, what are the truths that we can observe about this that may have some actionability? And one of the things I think you've gifted us with here is that you're writing them down. And just like we know this psychologically, creating a list of to dos and striking them off has mental health properties. Well, now you're telling me that putting a list of action and known items that are regarding a medical event or a training aspiration, we're doing something about it. You're adding the effectiveness right there by saying, we addressed this. I'm listening to you on this. And here's what our actionables are for this attribute that we both identified or that you identified to me. I love all of those things. anything else in summary today or something novel that you would like to add on before we wrap up?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
It gives you full permission. What else are you playing with mentally is a loaded question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the target is always moving. And,
Yeah.
the more that you lean into these conversations, the better. And I also think that, we're both clinicians here, that it's really important that you always trace things back to behaviors and behavioral objectives.
Hmm.
And, that we also, people come to us because they haven't been able to figure out a problem or a challenge that is starting to interfere with their life. And, to make sure that we put on our hat, that we're there to navigate and help them troubleshoot. We're not there to take ownership of their problem.
Hmm.
And I also think that we need to hold people accountable and sometimes have difficult conversations. And it's not to say that you don't care about the person. I think the patient will start to appreciate you care a lot about them through holding them accountable. And I think that that's something that's very challenging for a lot of younger clinicians because they're afraid that they're going to offend someone, right?
Yeah.
So, and I also think that so much of our work and our ability to help people comes down to our demeanor, our disposition. And if we can sort of have this calm, caring aspect to us, we can really tune into the right, wavelength or radio frequency to listen to the song or narrative that they're giving us, right?
Yeah.
So, I think oftentimes, especially for busy clinicians, that we have a lot on our mind and we're listening for our our own sake as opposed to that patient's sake. And people sense that straight away, right? So all this to say, be present, be a resource for people, realize you're going to make mistakes as a clinician, and to really keep things grounded in communication and to always look at, to go 30,000-foot view to make sure you understand what you're seeing, right? Because it's
Yeah.
very easy to get caught up in the minutia and the weeds. But to realize, the other thing that I'm going to weave into that piece that I'm working on about the screens is there's a foreground and there's a background to every clinical interaction. The
Hmm.
foreground, someone comes in, my leg's hurting, I'm having a tough time walking around. I was slated to do this marathon. Now I don't even know if I'm going to be able to make that trip. That's a foreground, and that's what we end
Hmm.
up trying to basically take a fire extinguisher and put it out with. But what we ultimately need to do is say, okay, what's the backdrop of this person's situation?
Hmm.
Because if we can form a bridge between the foreground and the background, that person is going to start to develop a more accurate narrative around their situation. And then we figure
Hmm.
out what are the levers that we need to pull, that they need to
Yeah.
pull, that we're going to help them navigate and cast a light on the path
Hmm.
while holding them accountable through that
Yeah.
process. That's what I think a lot about every clinical interaction. I'll see someone today dealing with a complex bone stress injury, and everyone gets so fixated on the injury. And I'm saying, well, you're a smart person. You wouldn't be here if you haven't figured this out on your own. What do you think engendered this? What
Hmm.
are the moving parts? What looks different now than maybe a year ago when you were training consistently and strong?
Right. Yeah.
And invariably, something comes up that they
Right.
haven't disclosed to anyone else because, no one has taken the time to make that person feel seen, heard, and validated,
Oh,
right? And until you do that, you're probably just breathing bad breath on someone.
yeah. Yeah.
So when I
Wow.
say you got to understand like the science of an injury, if someone comes in with a bone stress injury, risk factors, training practices, fueling, but you also need to appreciate the humanities. This person is perhaps dealing with a very stressful situation that is taking away maybe their agency. And that's what I'm always trying to figure out is, what's the bridge that we need to form between that foreground and
Yeah.
background? Because
Yeah.
I see, positive things happening.
Many people would be amazed at the commonalities between what we can classify as neurologic rehabilitation and what we might classify in your realm musculoskeletal sport performance. But what you just talked about are the integral commonalities, allowing people to feel and actually be seen, heard, valued, talk about agency, etc. I could have a person with a functional neurologic disorder that is having the same exact difficulties as what you're talking about here with an individual that's having a bone stress injury. What is different in your world right now that might have precipitated this to come about? And they'll be able to actually come up with the answer. And that is, again, oddly enough, a commonality between a bone stress injury and a functional neurologic disorder, so we can get at the crux of it. But I love what you've said here today as we begin to summarize, because one of the things you started with in this answer was accountability, and that we don't actually own the problem, we don't absorb the problem. And even though you didn't use the exact terms, you were actually also, to some degree, indirectly referring to the propensity of burnout and compassion fatigue when we become them, when we carry all of it back with us. And we talk about, in some cultures, it's considered to be the snake that eats itself, right? That is eating its own tail, the Ouroboros. And I love the way you express that, that we hold them accountable, still being very humanistic about it, not being, sterile and antiseptic, and that's a you problem type of thing, but actually supporting them through their discovery of what the problem is, through their solution of what the problem is, and then using our evidence and experience to be able to actually guide them toward the best selection of solutions that they can choose from. Yeah.
Yeah, you nailed it.
Well, all I did was summarize what I heard from you. So that's you nailed it, and I actually just finished it off there a little bit. Well, Chris, I can't thank you enough for the conversation. I'll obviously, utilize this material to contribute to the paper that I'm writing here about unintentional and intentional stressors. And what I hadn't expected, but I should have known was coming, is that there would be so many gems that when you suggested, hey, we should probably do video in case you want to record this is something that should be held on to, and some people will find some degree of value in listening to. So this is a repository that should not be held to itself. We might have to do some sharing of the gems that you've dropped on us today. Thank you.
Well, it's always a pleasure to catch up with you, Mike.
Yeah.
I hold you in high regard, and you have an uncanny ability or knack for taking very high level information and articulating it in a way that's very digestible. Now that I think about this, I was reading your draft of the paper
Oh, yeah.
uh, on the way home from mountain biking, and I just said, I was left spellbound. I couldn't believe just how impressive um, what you wrote was. So, anyways, as we're talking about this, I think that the quadrant you dubbed it what the living what was the
Challenge
exact,
Life Matrix.
yeah, the
The
challenge life.
Challenge Life. Yeah. Mhm.
I think so much of that dovetails with the screens,
Yeah,
and I
I
think
think it
the
does too.
screens take on a little bit more salience when someone has run amok,
Mhm.
and you're trying to basically get them to regain their lease on whatever their meaningful activity or activities are. But
Right.
yeah, that's one of my realizations from having this conversation with you. So it helped me refine
Yeah.
my thoughts. So thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Well, it won't be our last one. Chris, thank you. You go enjoy your day and take on your next persona, and good luck to you with your patient care and family interactions.
Back at you, Mike.
Catch you later.